There we go. Okay, welcome everybody. Thanks for joining us to the Lunchtime Lecture Series from the Fort Worth Botanic Garden and the Botanical Research Institute of Texas. I'm Dr. Brooke Best, Director of Research Programs, and I and my research colleagues host this lecture series, which takes place the first Tuesday of each month. Our next talk will be Tuesday, September 6th, when Dr. Andrea Weeks will present topics related to small herbarium digitization and reorganization projects. Viewers today will remain muted throughout the lecture, but you can type your questions in the chat at any time, and we'll go over those at the end during the Q&A session. And you're welcome to test it out and now if you'd like, and tell us where you are watching from. We will be recording this lecture for our archives, and the recording, with permission of the speakers, will be available on our YouTube channel in a few weeks. And if needed, links to other resources mentioned by the speakers would be posted on the web page for this event if needed. I recommend that if you experience any problems with the video or with the session, just exit the session and then you can rejoin with the original link. That should work. And yeah, let's get started. So it's my pleasure today to introduce our speakers. We have two, Dr. Patrick McIntyre and Wesley Knapp. Patrick serves as Senior Ecologist and Research and Development Manager for Western North America at NatureServe's office in Boulder, Colorado. In his 20 plus years in ecology and conservation, Patrick has also worked with the California Natural Heritage Program, the National Park Service, and he's collaborated on projects at UC Berkeley, San Diego State, and UNAM in Mexico. Patrick has a PhD in ecology from UC Davis and a master's in biology from Northern Arizona University. And our second speaker, I'm going to go ahead and introduce him now as well, Wesley Knapp. He's the chief botanist at NatureServe, and he has 20 plus years experience of working in the NatureServe Network as a botanist and ecologist with both Maryland and North Carolina natural heritage programs. And he's got extensive field experience across much of the U.S., plus parts of Australia, Canada, and Central America. He has a master's from Delaware State University and is currently a PhD student, among all the other things he's doing, but currently a PhD student at the University of North Carolina at Chapel Hill, working with Dr. Alan Weekly. So welcome, gentlemen, and I believe Patrick will be speaking first. Actually, oh, I lost my mouse. One moment. There we go. So Patrick will be speaking first, and I will hand it off now, or you can just take it straight from me whenever you're ready.
Okay. Let's see.
There we go.
Okay, folks seeing my screen, and can people hear me?
Yep. Yep, looks good.
Great. Well, I was going to say thanks so much, Brooke, LA, for inviting us to present. It's a real pleasure to be talking with folks at the Brit. I've seen a lot of involvement from botanists there over the years in different conservation projects. Know a few people who work there, so it's exciting to present to you all and perhaps learn a little bit more about Brit while I'm here. So I'll start us off today with kind of an overview of the NatureServe Network, a little bit more on the ecology side of things, which I focus on, and then I'll hand it off to Wes about halfway through for some exciting stories about plant extinctions, and the exciting part being rediscoveries. So I'll kick it off from here. So what does the NatureServe Network do? We really try and address the fundamental questions in conservation. What is it? Where is it found? How is it doing? So we document primarily rare and at-risk taxa from plants and animals. And then we try and use that data to assess are conservation actions helping, and are the actions, what conservation actions really do help, and what do we need to do to try and have more effective conservation. So I really want to stress that NatureServe is a network. We're based primarily in the United States and Canada. There's a heritage program or a NatureServe affiliate in each of the 50 states and many of the Canadian provinces and territories, and also some of the tribal nations in the US. We have fairly extensive collaborations throughout Latin America, and we're involved in broader conservation efforts throughout the world. I want to emphasize that our local partner in Texas is called the Texas Natural Diversity Database. They're part of the Texas Parks and Wildlife Program. Also, their wildlife diversity program is part of the NatureServe Network. And this map you're looking at here shows curated records for rare plants and animals across Texas. And when I show these maps of records, I think back a few years ago to, well, actually quite a few years ago now, around 2010, when many talks were saying we live in this amazing era of biodiversity, and that, you know, with a few keystrokes, we can download hundreds of thousands of records for different things. And as I've actually worked with these types of things, I realized that the challenge is not the availability of data, but how that data is really curated and presented. And the NatureServe Network really focuses on having biologists review records for rare and endangered species, ecosystems as well, so that when you access data from the network, you're really looking at something that has a lot of information on how much do we know about that record, how sure are we about where it is, are we confident or not confident in the identification. So with that, let me tell you a little bit more about NatureServe's work. We track in what's called NatureServe Explorer. We track taxonomy for both species and ecosystems with over 100,000 entries. We're fairly up to date. I believe we have entries for just about every plant taxa in North America that's currently recognized, along with the ability to add custom records that might be a new species locally described in a state that's of conservation concern. We also track ecosystems and their classifications through the U.S. National Vegetation Classification, which I'll mention a bit more about. And we have a database currently of about 1 million documented locations. And I want to emphasize these are very curated records. So one can go to, these include records from, say, the herbarium at Britt, iNaturalist, the Global Biodiversity Information Facility, other records that you can get. But these records have been reviewed by NatureServe biologists generally with extensive annotation about their reliability and other information about them. We also, as I mentioned, map ecosystems. I'll talk more about this later, but this is kind of a wall-to-wall map of different ecosystems in the United States that we have. And one of the ways that I think NatureServe is most encountered by people who might not be familiar with it is through our conservation status ranks. So across the network, we have conservation status ranks that indicate how at risk a species is, from it's widespread and secure, which we call a G5, to it's presumed extinct in the wild, or it's at extensive risk. And down below, I have the corresponding IUCN red list categories. So these are kind of a one-to-one crosswalk. We work very closely at times with the IUCN to rank species. We have projects together. I'd say we're a little bit more flexible as a smaller network rather than one that tries to serve the whole planet. So for North America, we can update these ranks a bit more quickly than through the IUCN process. Let's see. So this graph here shows the proportion of U.S. species at risk in these categories. So these are ones that are perhaps only known historically or are highly threatened or at risk. So these G1 through G3 categories. And you can see NatureServe has status ranks for just about every species in North America, many subspecies as well, with freshwater mussels, crayfish, amphibians, freshwater species popping out as, with over 50%, 35%, so forth, at risk in the United States. Looking at flowering plants, ferns, conifers down here. Generally, if you look up a plant that you might be interested in, it will have a NatureServe conservation status rank. And if you're entering a record, say perhaps folks use iNaturalist, if it has a NatureServe conservation status rank in one of these at-risk categories, your record might show up as hidden or secure from other people viewing it, in case that species might be something that might be poached, like succulents or so forth. I mean, just an example of how sometimes people encounter these status ranks. And really what we're trying to do at NatureServe is what we call supporting a decision life cycle from conservation data in the field to making decisions that have real impacts on the ground. We have applications to collect field data using your phone, can go to your local heritage program. We have databases of assembling data. I'll talk about modeling we do to predict where species are. We combine this in our website resources to communicate knowledge about things, about rare species. And then we work with a whole range of partners to try and implement decisions. Currently, we do a lot of work with the Bureau of Land Management, as well as the U.S. National Forest Service to try and improve management, as well as at times working with the National Park Service and other conservation agencies. So I want to talk a bit about some examples and stories, and I'll start out with some stories about our ecosystem and habitat related work, and then I'll pass it on to Wes. So one of the things that I'm most involved in as an ecologist at NatureServe is asking, how are ecosystems in North America doing when we look at habitats in relation to climate change? I've got a picture here showing pinyon juniper woodland in the southwestern United States. And this is a picture some of you may be familiar with, showing a dieback of pinyon trees within pinyon juniper habitat. This is an ecosystem that appears to be vulnerable to climate change, to increased temperatures, increased drought, etc. So NatureServe has worked on combining an index of different factors that are related to how ecosystems might be vulnerable or resilient to climate change. We've got things like how sensitive an ecosystem might be if it's highly fragmented, such as you see in this picture here. It might be very vulnerable to climate change. There's not a lot of, say, what we call matrix habitat for it to move through. It's surrounded by development. If an ecosystem is dominated, say, by a range of dominant taxa, it might have a greater capacity to adapt to changing climates because it's not dependent on the ability of, say, a single species or even a keystone species to persist or to classify that ecosystem. So we combine these factors and then we try and communicate, we combine these factors with exposure to climate. Then we try and come up with relatively simple ways to assess this risk. Is it, say, in this category down here, it's highly resilient with, it has high exposure to climate, but it has low resilience, or is it up here where it has high resilience and low exposure to climate space? So we'll try and categorize these, and is it at most risk here, where it's down here, where it has low resilience and high exposure, versus some of these other categories. So just walk you through kind of an example of how we do this. This map shows the magnitude of recent climate change from what is often used as a baseline, essentially 1950 to 1980 versus change in the last 30 years. And we're looking here, areas in that are more in yellow have a more novel climate. They fall outside of the typical range of historical variation in temperature, in contrast to certain areas down here in the southeast where they may still be falling within the historic range of temperature. So we use climate variables such as temperature, precipitation, multivariate expressions of that. And then we combine those climate variables with things like landscape conditions. So is the landscape highly fragmented? We have maps that show whether an ecosystem might be experiencing a strong departure from its historic fire regime. How at risk is the system from invasive plants? So many of you may be familiar with all across the western United States, annual cheatgrasses, bromes, in many areas have altered the fire regime. In areas where there wasn't an annual cover, extensive annual cover of grasses to carry fire, say between isolated shrubs or in the desert between very sparsely distributed plants. Nowadays, we have a situation where you can have fire occurring in habitats where it might not have occurred in the past. So we combine these all together and we weight them in different ways. So you can look at how sensitive, in this case, a sagebrush habitat would be across the landscape to climate change. And you can see some certain areas are predicted to be less sensitive in contrast to other variables that might be at high risk. Managers can use these maps to try and determine maybe what management actions they should take or planning for potential transitions between vegetation types even. We've done these types of assessments. The slide is a little bit out of date. I think we've assessed about 80 major ecosystems at this point in time, and we're often updating our assessments based on the most recent climate data, including everything from desert habitats to montane grasslands and alpine habitat. And I want to take a step back from this and go back to the types of work that really allow us to do these types of analysis. So NatureServe administers what's called the U.S. National Vegetation Classification. And this is a great example of how we work as a network. We kind of administer what's called the U.S. National Vegetation Classification, but we work with ecologists from all over North America, in every state, Canadian provinces, tribal nations, to find out what vegetation types they have locally within their areas. And then we apply standards and we integrate it and say this is say a dry forest type that's dominated by ponderosa pine, and it falls into a savanna category. And so we maintain a classification of these different ecosystem types that allows us to have a consistent map across the United States. This is showing 500 different vegetation types. I should say the National Vegetation Classification is a little bit like the taxonomy that you might be familiar with, where you can roll up from, say, a genus to a family level. We have what are called associations, which might be an alliance, say a Bouteloua grassland with a type of cactus, and then rolling that up might be broadly a Chihuahuan desert habitat. So we have different scales that we can move between. And this map here, we've developed in collaboration with the Landfire program, which is an interagency effort to map vegetation and work on especially fire risk. You can tell from their name. So this map here shows what we think is a reasonable estimation of the historic distribution of over 500 systems in the United States about 400 years ago. We can then combine that with information from satellites, on the ground information today to estimate types of rates of ecosystem loss across the US. And then we can work with groups such as the IUCN Red List of Ecosystems, of which we're a part, and we helped develop a corresponding concept for ecosystems that relates to the Red List of species. So just as species can be endangered, ecosystems can be at risk of collapse, or they can be thought to be, say, secure, they're wide-ranging, not vulnerable to climate. And those climate analyses I showed are one factor that we integrate into the Red List of ecosystems. So, how extensive is it? Is it vulnerable to climate? Has it been lost to development or modification? Right. So that's just a little bit about some of the habitat related work we do. I want to talk about another major initiative that NatureServe has been involved in over the last about 8 years now, which is a major effort in what we call predictive habitat modeling. You might also know it as species distribution modeling, environmental niche modeling. There's been a lot of names over the years for it. But the basic idea so you take occurrence data, so in this case where this salamander might be located, combine it with environmental predictors such as temperature, habitat type, things like that. And then you combine, in this case we have a cloud environment where we use some kind of advanced computing techniques to try and produce models of where species occur. And then importantly, something that we're involved in is we often have experts review these maps. We're involved in efforts to sometimes field validate them and then to revise these maps based on new occurrence data, based on expert review, saying, maybe we should use some different variables. Some of these records may not be quite accurate, etc. So we're quite proud to have recently been featured in the New York Times. This is from March this year. And these maps show a map of where, basically you could look at it as a map of endangered biodiversity in the continental US. And so areas in red are areas where we have a high degree of threatened or at-risk species. So I'm from California originally, and along the coast here, we have many, many endemic plants. It's a biodiversity hotspot. So this pops out here, as well as some other areas. I think this is where the Edwards Plateau and some of the oak habitat in Texas meets some of the more desert habitats further south, creating a hotspot there. And then kind of coming back to that risk of aquatic biodiversity, which is well known as some of the most threatened habitats in America. So these maps that were featured and that you can see here come from adding up and layering different models that we built for, in this case, I think about 1,200 different at-risk species. And I want to tell you a little bit more about that project and kind of walk you through it. So what we're looking at here is a slide that shows kind of a little bit about what a species habitat model is. This is an example of the golden cheek warbler, which occurs in Texas. And when we look at a species range, some cases we have, let me go back. Come on. There we go. We have here these cells are kind of parcels of land and so forth that are the official U.S. Fish and Wildlife Service endangered species range, kind of going back to our information back in the 80s or even the 70s. But today, combining these blue dots, which are known records, with those computer algorithms and environmental variables, we can create a model of where we think habitat for this warbler occurs. And if you can then imagine, we can build hundreds or even thousands of these models. We can then build a map that tries to look at where biodiversity might be most at risk. So this is just an example of some of the species that were involved. A little Polygonaceae, Coryzanthe or Cuttiana was one of my favorite groups in the buckwheat family. Another California species showing my bias here. We've got a sagebrush lizard in New Mexico and Texas, and some others. So these are actual, I believe what's being shown here are kind of, we're zoomed out. You can see a combination of the actual data, occurrence data where these species are. Then you can build models for, like I said, hundreds or thousands of these species, and you can sum them up. So here we have a map that shows the number of rare species that are predicted to occur within an area, going from 0 to 15. So areas in yellow have a lot more rare species. And then because not all rare species are necessarily distributed equally, we implement an algorithm that accounts for endemism. So how restricted is a species? This map here weights species by how geographically restricted they are. So if a species, say, occurs just at one locality, then it gets a very high rating, where if a species is rare, but it has a very broad geographic range, let's say it tends to occur across the Midwest, then it's kind of down-weighted. And this map here then accounts for some of those differences in distribution between more widely distributed species and local endemics. We can then do things like combine that map of at-risk species with what do we know about where we have conservation, say, areas in the United States. Areas in green come from the database of conserved areas. This includes national forests, national parks, areas with permanent easements, and so forth. There's a lot more locally that you can't see at this level, but it captures some of the big areas of protection, the national forests, national parks, monuments in the West, for example. You can overlay that, and then you can start to see areas that where you have high biodiversity that overlap with protection, and areas that perhaps don't. So California's Central Valley, highly agricultural. And this map here shows areas that were highlighted as particularly important for biodiversity conservation, but don't have currently, say, a formal level of protection on them, like a national park or a conservation easement. And I just want to point out, when you look at what species are in those areas or dependent on them, it turns out geographically, vascular plants account for the much of that distribution relative to birds, mammals, and amphibians, which tend to occur in areas that already receive some level of protection, with fairly little area of overlap. So with that, I kind of want to transition to Wes and talk about some of these threats to rare plants, and I'll leave it to you.
Hey everybody, I'm just trying to figure out how to switch my screens. This is always a challenge on my Mac for some reason. So just give me 1 second. I'll slide this presentation over here and do this instead. Everybody should be able to see that screen now, right? Let me full screen it. Yes? Okay, great. So thank you, Patrick, for the intro, and thanks for having us here today. I'm really excited to talk to, frankly, my people who are interested in plants. I am among you, and this is going to be great to talk. I'm going to talk really briefly about a project I started when I was at the Natural Heritage Program in North Carolina, identifying plant extinction events in the US and Canada. And that was the first time I got to work with Patrick, which was great. But, it really brings home the message of conservation through collaboration. This is a big continental effort to identify plant extinction events, and it was largely built on natural heritage data and other expert opinion to refine our data. So this paper is open access. You can get it freely. And I got an email from Wiley recently saying this is in their top 10 downloaded articles of all their journals this year. So there is interest in plant conservation, no matter what people tell you. So as Patrick mentioned, we have a big data set in NatureServe about plants, and we have these two categories we don't use a lot, this extinct GX and historic GH. These are important categories. GX is more of the, we've kind of given up, it's gone category. And GH is the more presumed or potentially extinct category, in which maybe we can still find it with some effort. So we started with that data and a bunch of regional data in floras and manuals, and honestly talking to other botanists such as yourself about what's in your state that may be gone. But we ended up with a ton of names. As you can imagine, standards are hard to come by for plants that are consistent and updated. So we had first 150 names we had to vet through, and that included things like Franklinia, which I'm sure we've all heard of. And that's a plant that's universally accepted by everyone as distinct. And then we had plants like Rubus fryi that is either an extinct single-site endemic of West Virginia or not real. So you have two extreme options. So we had to come up with a new method to kind of unify taxonomy for the purpose of this paper. So we came up with the Index of Taxonomic Uncertainty, which is really just a scientific consensus of a name. We went to the primary literature, floras, and manuals to see how different experts treated all the entities on our list, and we came up with a score of A to F. A being a taxon of universally accepted recognition, like Franklinia. You will not encounter a manual that does not have that as a distinct entity. Sometimes it's put in the genus Cordonia, but it's still recognized as a distinct taxon. Then you have plants like Juncus purvitus, which has a score of B, which is more often than not accepted as a distinct entity, but occasionally, I think it was one instance, Gleason and Cronquist recognized they thought this was a waif from Europe. And the Europeans have a lot of literature saying that is not the case. So there's a little bit of taxonomic debate around category B. You have category C, where there's more taxonomic debate. Less than 50% of manuals and floras will recognize it as distinct, but still there are numerous experts who argue that this is a distinct entity. And then you have categories like D and F that are really problematic because they're described and very rarely recognized, or they were described and then summariously lumped forever after. So for the purposes of this study, we just looked at categories A, B, and C, where there's either unanimous acceptance or significant or a lot of meaningful taxonomic kind of debate around these entities. And there's a lot of work to be done in categories B and C, and maybe that will drive future efforts at BRIC because you have a number of plants that fall into that B, C, D, F category in Texas. So just some results to go over quickly. We had 51 species and 65 taxa that are believed to be extinct in the US and Canada. That's a 108 increase from any previous study. That just shows to the importance of data quality and data interpretation. We can talk about the previous study if you want to after this talk. But one of the big take-home messages here is that 42 taxa, or 64% of those extinct plants, were what we called single site endemics. They were known from just one place on the landscape. But you have to ask the question, were these really single site endemics, or were they only just collected from one place? Because when you talk about extinct plants, oftentimes we know very little about them. We'll come back to that question in a little bit. And just to drive home the point about NatureServe data, only 2 of these plants were considered extinct on the IUCN Red List. So we actually worked to get a few more of these listed, and there's a lot more work to be done, frankly. When you look at the total flora of the US of 15,882 species or so, that gives you a rate of about 0.4% of the flora and an extinction rate at the time of publication of about 3 plants per decade. And that's a really important benchmark because, as you can imagine, we're going to see increased extinction rates as we move through the Anthropocene. So now we have at least a baseline to look at as we revisit this data set in 10, 20-year increments moving forward. We had some family breakdowns for you. Big families lost a lot like you'd expect. But there's also some bias here as well. Like I love sedges, grasses, and rushes. Only 2 grasses, only 1 sedge. That's probably an artifact of data and collection effort by Botanist. Also, we only had 1 orchid, which is a bit surprising. But I'll also want to point out we had 53 genera. And of those, we had Crataegus as a big loser, and there's a lot of taxonomic uncertainty in Crataegus. This could be a very low number. A lot of names exist in the literature. Then we had 3 Astragalus, 3 Cryptantha, and 3 Plagiobothris. But I want to point out one of the interesting, surprising results was that these 2 genera that compose all 6 of the Borodaginaceae, which is one of the largest families and one of the largest extinct plant families now, those are sister genera, all located with one subtribe. So something could be going on here, maybe disease, pest, don't know. But the idea that all 6 of these extinct plants in the Borodaginaceae represent 2 genera that are sister genera is a real outlier. So looking at the data from a geographic perspective, you'll see there's a real heavy southwest tint to this map. I think that's very real, and frankly, well, that may not be real and may be an artifact of data availability. The West was botanized at least lightly before it was developed broadly by Eastern Europeans. As you can imagine, people were landing in the East Coast and just trying to survive. They weren't really taking baseline botanical inventories. So this could be an artifact of data collection, pointing out big area of the country that doesn't really have anything in the Great Plains. And then also some biodiversity hotspots like the Panhandle and the Slake Whale Sand Ridge with nothing. This is probably just also an artifact of sampling before habitat destruction. I'll also mention really quickly dark extinctions. These are extinctions that happened in the darkness. They are organisms that went extinct before they were described to science. I predict that we're going to have more of these in at the Euroherbarium. There are probably species lurking that are undescribed and already extinct. I'll just point out we've had 4 of these that have been documented since 1995 that cover the continental US pretty well. Coriospermum pallidum is a Pacific Northwest plant. Bovenia floridana is a Floridan orchid that probably went extinct due to overcollection. Potentilla uliginosa is in California, and then Marshallia grandiflora is actually something I worked on that was not recognized as a distinct and now extinct entity until some work we published with Alan Weekly and Derek Poindexter in Phytotaxa in 2000. So reasons for extinction really vary. I also want to make a point that overcollection appears to be one of those problematic things that did occur. Merritt Fernald at Harvard was a brilliant botanist, but he really baled some hay on some very rare plants like Digitaria filiformis variety Levaglumis, which is a project I won't have time to talk about today, but there were 34 herbarium sheets that we found so far of this plant that was known from just the type locality. Juncus purvitus here shown on the left, 56 herbarium sheets were collected of this plant that was only known from one very small place in Cape Cod, Massachusetts. Those type of collections certainly caused the extinction or helped lead to the extinction of that organism. We also have a category that was really interesting to dig into, this extinct in the wild category. When we think about Franklinia, that's technically what we have. It's extinct in the wild. We only know it from the garden trade. But there were actually potentially seven that we identified through work with the Botanical Gardens Conservation International. Now you'll see there's question marks on two of those because the institutions reporting to have those collections didn't reply to queries about is the material accurately identified, which is a real important question. So those have question marks. But the other five are plants that are truly extinct in the wild. A poster child for me in learning about extinct in the wild here was this Arctostaphylos franciscana. This poses a real difficult challenge. So the definition we're using for this work is no naturally occurring populations, because the story here is that this plant, Arctostaphylos franciscana, was thought to be extinct and rediscovered in 2007 or 2008. Unfortunately, it was rediscovered right along a road that led to the Golden Gate Bridge that was going to be developed as part of a shovel-ready project. There was really no stopping this project. So we did collectively, Dan Glausenkamp was really involved in this, one of my co-authors. They did the best they could and they dug it up and moved it. Now it's not far away, but it's certainly in a new location. This is essentially a translocation or assisted migration. But if you use the definition, no naturally occurring populations, this now clearly fits that definition. We could talk more about extinct in the wild some other day. I have goals and hopes to bring together all those extinct in the wild plants as part of an exhibit to reach the public about the plight of plant conservation and extinction in North America. Now, some of those other causes of extinction, we all probably understood this, habitat destruction and alteration, certainly. But frankly, it's really difficult to know the cause of an extinction unless it was a single site endemic the site was destroyed. All of their times are kind of guessing, or it's multifaceted. For instance, Crataegus fecunda and Micranthemum micranthomoides are the only two species that I'd call broad ranging. They occurred in 4 or more states. And we're not really sure why either of these organisms went extinct. We just know when it was last collected, and we know very little about the threats or trends to those organisms before they went extinct. So part of this is clearly a call to action, because preventing extinction is the lowest bar for success we can set, and we're not always exceeding. And one of the things I'm trying to do now that I'm here at NatureServe is to help prioritize single-site endemics for priority in situ, which is on-site, and ex situ, off-site conservation. And that's led to a real fun project to look on Southwest Texas red oaks. And this is a project really spearheaded by the Morton Arboretum in the U.S. Botanical Garden. I got involved when I was with the North Carolina Natural Heritage Program. I took vacation for 2 weeks, different times a year, to go explore Southwest Texas. But most recently, we had this big collaborative effort, which involved Adam Black at Bartlett, Michael Houston at San Antonio, Emily Griswold at UC Davis, Philip Schultze at Lady Bird, Elizabeth Thompson at Polly Hill, and Zara Wiley, who's an arborist in California, to go look for one of these single-site endemics in these potentially extinct Quercus tardifolia, because there's real issues of the delineation of some of these species in Southwest Texas, and knowing what the entities are is the basic question. What is it? If you don't know what it is, you can't determine where it is and how it's doing. So this is our kind of our glamour boy shot. Those presses are completely full of herbarium material. They were used the physical herbarium vouchers that complemented molecular vouchers from all the red oaks we encountered in Southwest Texas. And part of this was certainly the hunt for Quercus tardifolia. This was a single site endemic to Boot Canyon in Big Bend National Park in Texas. It is morphologically really quite distinct from any other member of that group, with these broad leaves and that dense, almost albate arachnoid pubescence on the back of the leaves. So we've destructively sampled this last collection made by Mike Powell, and then also we were allowed to destructively sample part of the holotype. You can't see that, was last collected in 1932. and this had an ITU of B. So it was one of those plants that's more often than not accepted as distinct, but very occasionally it's considered a hybrid. And knowing what the entities are is really important. So there's a large smear of morphology in Southwest Texas, from Quercus amorii, which is G5, through a G1 Quercus robusta, a GH Quercus tardifolia, and a G5 Quercus gravesii. And there's also a Quercus scrofiliformis that fits into this morphologic variation as well. So a lot of questions about what Quercus tardifolia was, and what is Quercus robusta, and what is Quercus graminifolia, and if they do warrant conservation action. So we spent a week in Big Bend. We took burros out to our site. They carried our camp gear. We had a wonderful, Kelsey was our camp manager, helped provide our food and helped pack all this gear. If you're not familiar with Boot Canyon, it gets that name because of that geological spire that kind of looks like an upside down boot placed on top of a top there. But this is a rugged place. Inventory is hard. It's steep, forested, really rough. And on the third day, after seeing thousands of oaks, Michael Eason called out to me. He's to the right of the trunk right there, and he found Quercus tardifolia. And he called me over first, and this thing was clearly different from any of the other oaks we'd seen in our previous 3 trips to Big Bend. I then called over Adam Black, who's the guy, large guy on the end there with the hat, the big 10-gallon hat. He confirmed the identification, like we all agree that is Quercus tardifolia. So we were able to rediscover this extinct species, but I'm going to point out it's really not doing that well. There's a lot of epiconic branching. There was a fire at the base and it's fungal infected. So we're prioritizing ex situ conservation for this single site endemic now, because it is truly on the precipice of extinction, and we have one of those rare second chances to prevent the extinction of an organism. So talking about single site endemics has led me to this next issue about the need to prioritize work in ex situ collections. And that, like, if I look for something like Sarracenia aureophila in the Botanical Gardens Conservation International database, you see there's 44 sites worldwide with collections of this plant. That's great, but that's probably more than the total number of wild populations. Where if I look for something like Pacorus serpenticola, which is imaged here on the left, there are no collections. This is a single site endemic from North Carolina. So I argue we need to really prioritize these single site endemics for conservation before they're gone, because all of their eggs are in one basket. Now, this is a collaboration I started with Anne Francis, the former lead botanist in the NatureServe, and my woman I work with, Amanda Trayer. And right now we have 89 single site endemics that need to be prioritized for ex situ and in situ conservation, but we're still vetting this data set. It's still very rough. But it brings me to a larger point I touched on earlier, is what do we mean when we say single site endemic? And I think we need to broaden what we're talking about. So a single site endemic, we all have an idea what that is. It's a plant that evolved and is found only at one place, will probably ever only be found at one place. What I'm thinking we're seeing is that we had very rare plants that were known from, let's say, 3 populations, and 2 of those are now lost. So we're down to one known occurrence. I call those OCOs. And we need to prioritize these OCOs, these plants of one known occurrence, for immediate conservation action. And when we look at that map of biodiversity importance and we overlay this preliminary data, you'll see hot spots that are hot. 29 are in California right now, 11 and 12 in Texas, respectively. And then a smattering of single site endemics or plants of one known occurrence across the US, including interesting places like Vermont, like you might not expect. And frankly, we're not doing well at capturing this group of plants. Right now, we have 89 in the data set, and only 9 are listed under the Endangered Species Act. Because with the ESA, extreme rarity does not warrant listing. For instance, Solidago plumosa here is a global single site endemic that was petitioned and decided not to be listed by the U.S. Fish and Wildlife Service. 38 of these OCO plants are known from collections, ex situ collections at the CPC National Collection, and 55 are already found at BGCI partnering institutions. We'd really want to vet those identifications, but you'll see we're still falling short from capturing all of these plants. So just bringing it all together, I just want to point out none of these really impactful conservation projects can be done without giant, high quality and unified data sets. And what we do really is try to fulfill what we call the data to decisions life cycle. In my previous career, I was collecting that field data using apps or just paper on the ground, and then curating that data into Biotics, our centralized database, which upticked to NatureServe Central, where I am now. And now I'm in a different role. I get to help calculate those global conservation status assessments and help disseminate that knowledge on tools like NatureServe Explorer and NatureServe Explorer Pro, which will be coming out soon. And then we can make high quality conservation-based decisions based on that data. And that is everything. So thank you, and hope there are some questions.